Before proceeding, viewers are advised to exercise caution. The following is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is a verbatim reproduction of testimony in federal court in the case of Sean Diddy Combs, as reported by Inner City Press. There was a tense, almost palpable silence in the hall. People looked at each other, not understanding what was happening, and some began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone had come for their own reasons, some to watch, some to participate, some just to be seen. But no one, absolutely no one, even in their wildest dreams, expected him to show up. Denzel Washington. When he entered, the room seemed to stop breathing. There were no fanfare, no announcer calling his name. There was nothing but this silent, heavy pause. Because at that moment, it became clear. He wasn't there for the big words, the red carpet, or the friendly slaps on the back for the cameras. It wasn't part of a plan or a prearranged program. He came because he couldn't stay silent any longer. Denzel walked slowly, calmly, without trying to impress anyone. But he made an impression simply by showing up. Respect for him was evident in every detail. How people involuntarily straightened their shoulders when he walked by. How conversations were hushed, how fake smiles disappeared. He wasn't just an actor. He was a symbol. The face of Hollywood, but not the Hollywood that is full of scandals and self-admiration, but the Hollywood that still remembers what honor is. The court fell silent. The room was so quiet that you could hear someone drop a pen. Everyone turned their heads toward the door when it opened, and no one could believe their eyes. He was alone, without security, without camera flashes, as if he had come not to a high-profile hearing, but to a regular business meeting. He was wearing a strict dark suit and holding a plain sheet of paper in his hand, slightly crumpled, as if he had held it many times, wondering whether to come. He calmly walked to the podium, sat down, and looked straight at Diddy. At that moment, something barely perceptible flashed between them. A glance that made the air in the room grow slightly colder. There was no anger or fear, but it was clear that they both understood without words. When he was asked to take the oath, he nodded and, without taking his eyes off the sheet, repeated the words. And then, silence. He was silent for a long time, so long that some of those present began to look at each other. But Denzel wasn't silent because he was confused. He was silent because it was the last minute of his old life, the one where he had remained neutral, kept his distance, and believed that silence would save him. And then he spoke, calmly, confidently, without hysteria or posturing. His voice sounded like a gunshot in an empty hall. He said he couldn't keep silent any longer, that he had looked away for too long, hoping that if he didn't interfere, everything would resolve itself. That he, like many others, had thought, "It's none of my business." But now it was his business. Because the truth, stuck in your throat, becomes heavier than any burden over time. And he was no longer going to carry it. He didn't come to save anyone, to take revenge, or to justify himself. He came to tell it like it is. And the room listened to him as if something more than just another case depended on it. He began without unnecessary introductions, calmly, but in such a way that everyone in the room listened. It was as if he was not telling a sensational story, but some old, long-known story that no one had dared to say out loud. He said that in the early 2000s, Diddy stopped being just a music producer. By then, he was no longer confined to studios and stages. He was drawn to a different, more influential environment. Hollywood welcomed him with open arms, and he quickly found himself among those who decided who could do what and who couldn't. Diddy began to behave as if no laws applied to him, neither moral nor legal. It was as if he was no longer just a participant in show business, but its unofficial owner. And at first, it all seemed harmless. Sure, parties, connections, self-confidence, nothing new for this industry. But over time, Denzel began to notice how the man himself was changing. Something strange appeared in Diddy's behavior. It was no longer bravado, but mania. He talked more and more about power, about his legacy, as if he were building something much bigger than just a career. Then one day, Denzel recounted, Diddy suddenly uttered a strange phrase, casually, almost jokingly, but with a look that stuck with him for a long time. "My empire will outlast gravity." At the time, it seemed like just another grandiose statement. Well, anyone can say anything, especially when there's too much champagne and too few witnesses. But then, with each passing year, with each new rumor and hint, It became clear that he wasn't speaking figuratively. He really did consider himself above the rules, above consequences, even above reality. Denzel continued in the same calm voice, as if recalling a strange episode from a long-ago life. He told how he had once been invited to a private dinner in Nevada. The atmosphere there was strange, not just elite, but almost conspiratorial. The room was filled with celebrities, Silicon Valley billionaires, and people who had their own logos instead of business cards. There were no journalists, phones were left at the door, and everything that was discussed was to remain within those walls. And in this environment, Diddy approached him. He spoke quietly, but with obvious fatigue. He said he was tired of Earth. He was tired of cameras, rules, public opinion. He was not going to be part of this world anymore. "I'm leaving," he said, as if announcing a vacation but without a return date. Then he took out a tablet and showed him something that looked like science fiction. It wasn't a script for a new movie. It was a diagram, precise, technical, and detailed down to the smallest detail, the launch of a capsule into orbit. Not just capsules, something like an elite club in space. There were velvet armchairs, relaxation areas, an isolated audio system, and a special camera that Diddy called the Heavenly Salon. He talked about it as if he were building not a project, but a new civilization. He said he was already working with a private aerospace company, and that everything had been calculated, from launch to return if there was to be one. He planned to send 10 people there, not just anyone, not just rich people. Only those who had been vetted, those who knew how to keep quiet, those who didn't ask questions. He called it Freak Off. Essentially, it was an illegal party, beyond Earth's control, beyond morality for that matter, everything in zero gravity, where there were no consequences, no observers, where there wasn't even gravity to keep common sense in check. And at that moment, according to Denzel, he was truly scared for the first time, because he realized this wasn't fantasy, this was a plan. Denzel was stunned, but still couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. In his head, it sounded like the plot of a science fiction movie, rich people flying away from their problems into space, as if it were the simplest solution. But then confirmation came from a mutual acquaintance who was directly involved in the matter. And then it became clear, this was not a joke or a dream, but a cruel reality. He said that preparations were in full swing. Land had already been purchased, not just anywhere, but in South America, exactly where they planned to build the launch site. The investment of billions was serious and large-scale, not some crazy idea like a garage startup. Everything was carefully thought out. Blueprints were signed, documents were prepared, and contracts were signed. This was not just a project. It was an attempt to escape responsibility here on Earth, to escape the law, morality, and public control. Diddy even started compiling a list of people who would fly with him. The list included former stars, producers, bloggers, people who had reasons to disappear from view, who had skeletons in their closets, who were afraid that their lives were about to explode under the pressure of scandals and exposés. It was a real elite escape operation. People didn't just want to have fun, they wanted to disappear. And the more Denzel delved into the story, the more he realized that this wasn't just the madness of one man, but a whole system, carefully planned and ready to go. The real climax of this incredible story came when plans that seemed like something out of science fiction suddenly began to turn into concrete actions. This was no longer empty talk or conspiracy theories. The construction of a space shuttle had indeed begun, and someone was taking it seriously. One of the contractors hired to build the shuttle was an engineer with many years of experience, accustomed to strict scientific standards and transparency in his work. At first, everything went according to plan, but soon he began to notice strange things. For example, unusually powerful soundproofing was installed inside the shuttle's structure, which made no practical sense for a spacecraft. Instead of focusing on safety and functionality, engineers were investing resources in creating conditions reminiscent of a recreation room, or, as it later turned out, a party room. In addition, the contractor noticed systems that simulated twilight, artificial lighting that changed to create the effect of changing times of day. This is unnecessary for spaceflight and can even be harmful. There were also complex acoustic installations that did not meet any scientific standards and seemed more like part of a sound show. All these details together aroused the engineer's suspicions. He understood that this shuttle was not just a vehicle for launching into space, but rather a recreation room in zero gravity, which Diddy referred to as a freak-off. At the end of 2023, he couldn't take it anymore and decided to report his suspicions to the authorities. A secret investigation was launched involving the most serious federal agencies. The authorities put key figures in the project under surveillance, gathered evidence, and tried to understand the true scale of this venture. In early 2024, federal agents were able to record an event that confirmed the seriousness of the threat. A plane linked to Diddy landed near the launch site in Suriname, exactly where Denzel said the launch was planned. This confirmed that the project had moved beyond the planning stage and was entering the preparation phase for the actual launch. Internal documents obtained during the investigation showed that the launch of the space capsule was scheduled for March 2024. This meant that the authorities had very little time to stop it, and the danger that the project could actually be carried out was becoming increasingly real. With each new detail, it became clear that this was not just a crazy idea of one person, but a carefully planned attempt to escape earthly laws, responsibility, and consequences. In this context, Denzel's silence, his confession, and his courage to tell the truth took on a special meaning. After all, not only the future of the project depended on it, but also the very moral fabric of society. The court, which at first viewed everything that was happening with disbelief and surprise, gradually understood the full depth of what was happening. What at first seemed like fantasy or an overly bold invention turned out to be a real escape plan. But not just an escape from life or problems, but an escape from justice and responsibility. This plan was so crazy and large-scale that it was hard to believe. Elite people, celebrities, and influential figures were going to just disappear, leave Earth, and escape the laws, rules, and punishments that applied to them. It looked like an attempt to build their own world where no one could stop them. But this crazy plan was only stopped because someone from within the system, someone who cared, finally decided to speak up. Without this courageous step, the secret project would have continued, and the consequences could have been much more serious. It was thanks to this inner voice, thanks to the fact that the truth was heard and conveyed to those who could intervene, that what could have been the most grandiose attempt to evade responsibility in history was stopped. The court, though stunned, took control of the situation, showing that even in the face of the most incredible and large-scale conspiracies, the law remains the law. So what happened next? While everyone was wondering whether Diddy was just delusional or really ready to walk away from everything, he decided to show that his words were not empty. He really tried to disappear. Not figuratively, but literally. He was going to leave Earth in the very capsule that had been talked about so much, and he called this event the Awakening. The name sounds almost like an advertisement for some trendy spiritual development or pseudo-yoga course that promises to reveal the secrets of the universe and make you a better person. But behind this colorful word lay a much more mundane and cruel reality. It was an attempt to escape the consequences of his actions, from responsibility, from the problems that had long since haunted him. He wanted to start his life over, but not just in a different place. He wanted to literally leave Earth free from rules and laws. It was a desperate and frightening step because it showed how far a person is willing to go to avoid punishment and maintain their position. But as it turned out later, he was unable to carry out his plan completely. Forces intervened that did not allow him to simply disappear. And this intervention became a turning point, showing that even the most ambitious and insane plans have their limits. Federal agents had no intention of waiting for Diddy and his capsule to break away from Earth and disappear into the endless expanse of space. They understood that a delay could be too costly. Too much effort and resources had already been invested in the investigation, and the consequences could be catastrophic. So they quickly contacted the local authorities to organize a joint operation and carefully planned the raid. The raid took place just as Diddy was showing two of his assistants the inner workings of the capsule, as if showing off his toy. The capsule was in perfect condition and completely ready for launch. There was already food packed for a long stay, curtains for privacy, various oils, possibly for massage or skincare in zero gravity, oxygen tanks for breathing, and stimulants, which were most likely intended to keep the crew alert and in good spirits during the flight. It all looked not just like a technical spacecraft, but more like a space hotel, a cozy and well-thought-out place for VIP relaxation in zero gravity. It felt like Diddy was hoping not just to escape his problems, but to treat himself to a luxurious vacation where no earthly rules would have any power. When agents burst in and arrested him, he didn't lose his cool and uttered a phrase that was meant to sound defiant and prophetic: "You can't lock up the future." In his opinion, it was a profound thought, capable of elevating him above everyone else, as if he were the harbinger of a new era that no one could stop. But in reality, it looked pretty pathetic. When a person is caught red-handed committing a crime, such words are perceived as an attempt to hide fear behind a screen of grandstanding. Instead of admitting defeat, he tried to appear like a prophet and revolutionary. But all this only emphasized his despair and powerlessness in the face of the law. The prosecutor's office later conducted a thorough investigation and discovered a very important detail. Diddy wasn't just trying to escape in a panic, as it might have seemed at first. Everything had been thought out in advance, and this escape was part of a carefully planned scheme. They discovered that long before these events, he had transferred all his real estate in the US, houses, villas, and other expensive properties, to shell companies and firms. This is a classic move that is usually used to cover one's tracks and keep property out of reach of possible claims. So his attempt to flee in a space capsule was not just a spontaneous panic, but a conscious decision to disappear completely. Not just to hide for a while, but to start a new life in a completely new place, far from those who knew him and the problems that haunted him. He wanted to go so deep that no one would ever be able to find him or make him answer for his past. It wasn't just an attempt to get away, it was an attempt to erase himself from life, to become a man without a past or obligations. A real bomb exploded in the courtroom the moment Denzel spoke again. The atmosphere in the room became frozen. Everyone felt that something very serious and unexpected was about to be said. Denzel said that his darkest and most painful memories were not related to the space capsule or his grandiose plans to escape into space. The worst, he said, happened behind the closed doors of Diddy's mansion, in places where no one could usually see and where no outside ears could hear. And then he uttered the phrase that made the courtroom literally hold its breath and forget everything for a few seconds. He had come to court not only to talk about how he had seen Diddy treat adult men, which was disturbing enough in itself, but, more importantly, he was prepared to testify about how Diddy treated his children. These words came as a real shock. No one expected the case to take such a turn, that such horrific details would emerge from the life of a man who seemed to many to be simply influential and successful. Now everyone understood. This was about much deeper and more serious things that could change everything they thought they knew about Diddy and his true character. The courtroom fell so silent that you could hear the air trembling softly. Everyone present was paralyzed by what they had heard. The story was so shocking and unexpected. The judge tried to regain control of the proceedings, but his voice sounded heavy and tense as he called everyone to order. It was clear that the atmosphere had changed forever. The invisible barrier between a normal court case and something personal and terrible had been broken. Denzel began his story by saying that in 2016, he was invited to a so-called inspirational lunch for young actors. It sounded nice and even noble, an opportunity to be inspired, receive support and advice. But the reality turned out to be much darker. Behind the facade of this event lay something completely different. A cruel and sinister atmosphere that Denzel will remember for the rest of his life. During this lunch, he witnessed a horrific scene. A security guard with an expression of stern necessity on his face literally dragged a tearful teenager, one of Diddy's sons, up the wide staircase of the mansion. The child was clearly frightened and did not resist, but tears were streaming down his cheeks. It was obvious that he was suffering, but no one around him seemed to notice his pain. Soon, the silence was broken by sharp cries, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Someone had clearly hit something made of glass or broken a window. The sounds were frightening and harsh, as if the walls of the mansion themselves were absorbing the violence taking place inside. Then, Diddy's voice rang out, cold, authoritative, leaving no doubt as to his cruelty. "You will learn discipline in this house, or you will disappear like the rest." These words hung in the air like a sentence, without the slightest hint of compassion or understanding. Denzel then tried to approach the boy and talk to him, to try to understand, to help, to support. The teenager bowed his head and whispered barely audibly, "It's just his way of showing love." The phrase sounded almost like an excuse, but Denzel didn't believe it for a second. He knew that behind those words lay real pain and fear. This memory haunts him to this day. He said that he saw even harsh military generals, known for their strictness and discipline, treat their children more gently and humanely than the man who called himself the father in that house. For Denzel, this became one of his most difficult and frightening memories, because it destroyed the image of power and strength, revealing its dark side that cannot be ignored. Over the years, Denzel learned more and more dark details. He was told that Diddy's children acted as servants at parties. They brought drinks to guests, accompanied them to different rooms, and were not allowed to speak first. One of the children was even like a living buffer, keeping a distance between the guests and the hosts, as if acting as a mediator or a living wall. It all looked like shameful slavery in a house that was supposed to be a place of family and comfort. In 2018, Denzel decided to take the most risky step. He tried to talk directly to Diddy himself. His response was cold and cynical. Lions are raised by throwing them to wolves. With this phrase, Diddy justified his cruel parenting methods, believing that such a tough school toughens character and prepares one for a harsh life. And then Denzel moved on to the most personal and heartbreaking part. He recounted how he had remained silent for 10 years, not out of ignorance, but out of fear. Fear bound his tongue and his heart. At those parties, he saw fear in the eyes of children and artificially created masks, attempts to hide their true feelings and conceal their pain. He observed a silence that was louder than any words. Even when he was told that he, Denzel, could be the one to finally change the situation, to bring the truth to light, he still backed down. The fear of betraying his family, destroying their lives, and hurting his loved ones paralyzed him. It was a real internal struggle, the desire to speak and act on the one hand, and the fear of losing everything on the other. All this time, Denzel lived with a heavy sense of betrayal. He felt like a man whom his children considered a hero, but who behaved like a complete coward. He was tormented by dreams in which he saw those very parties at Diddy's house, but the faces of all the participants were covered, hidden in shadows like masks. And among them, like a prisoner, was his own child, locked up, crying, helpless. These dreams haunted him and only intensified his inner pain and guilt. He understood that if he didn't tell the truth now, Diddy would simply fly away into space, away from all his earthly problems and responsibilities. And all those who had suffered would remain here on Earth in pain and silence. That's why he decided to come forward and reveal everything he knew. But it wasn't just about Diddy. Denzel revealed an entire system that covered for him and helped hide the truth. It included lawyers, PR people, bosses, and so-called cleanup crews who worked after parties. But these people didn't just clean up the mess. They destroyed any traces, physical, digital, anything that could lead to exposure. He recalled how in 2015, he noticed one of the security guards packing hard drives with unknown contents. When Denzel asked, the guard waved him off and said it was just a confidentiality protocol. It later emerged that the drives contained recordings of guests who had no idea they were being secretly filmed. In 2018, he received a letter from one of the top managers warning him, "If the press gets hold of File 03, we're all done for." Denzel deleted the letter, but it remained forever in his memory as a stark reminder of the scale of what was being hidden. And finally, the icing on the cake was a copy of the agreement Denzel signed in 2011. At first glance, it looked like a simple invitation to a party. But in reality, it was a strict non-disclosure agreement with harsh consequences for violators. Your career is over if you break the rules. That's how the system worked. Either you play by its rules, or you're simply erased, made invisible, and forgotten. At the end, Denzel addressed Diddy himself for the first time. His voice was calm, but every word was firm, leaving no room for doubt. You thought that if you made it to space, you'd be untouchable, but you didn't understand one thing: you can't escape the truth. He turned to the audience, all eyes on him, and added, if he had flown away, he would have gotten away with it. Everything would have been hushed up again. That couldn't be allowed to happen. Then Denzel remembered a party where Diddy, already visibly drunk, whispered in his ear, "I'll never get caught. I am not of this world." At that moment, it became clear that this man truly believed in his own impunity, that he was above all laws and rules. Denzel ended his speech simply and clearly. "I didn't come here for applause. I came here to put an end to this." He calmly and slowly walked out of the hall without saying another word. A deathly silence reigned in the hall. No one dared to applaud because this was not a moment for ovations, but a moment for silence and reflection. And at that very moment, when all eyes were on him, even Diddy himself couldn't take it anymore. He covered his face with his hands, as if trying to hide from the truth that had finally caught up with him.